Hi, my name is Phil. I like talking about politics, and a lot has been made of the fact that the EU will not agree a free trade deal with the UK, that is one that won't require import duties or quotas, unless the UK agrees to operate on a level playing field. So in this video, I'll be explaining how level the EU will require that field to be. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, then please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, the UK government under Boris Johnson has made it clear that the UK will not adopt EU laws in return for a free trade agreement. From the point of view of the EU, it says, well, that's fine. There are other ways to do this. It just means that Britain is going to have to put up with a lot more bureaucracy. It would be less bureaucracy if it would just adopt them. But that's on our heads, not theirs. They're okay with that. However, there has to be equivalence in certain areas for access to markets to be two-way. Essential in any free trade deal that is worthy of the name. But what standards will the UK have to sign up to and in which areas? So the second question is rather easier, because there seems to be a consistent line that the UK should agree to minimum standards of three main areas. One is worker protections, secondly is environmental standards, and third state aid rules. Now, the worker rights and environmental protections is a bit of a sticking point because they were in the original withdrawal agreement and then Boris Johnson removed them, indicating that he doesn't really wish to keep in line with them. But that is going to be an absolute red line. But that largely seems to be it. If the UK wishes to diverge in other areas, it would appear that the EU have no problems with that at all, with a small number of provisos which, when you look at them, essentially fit into one of those three categories anyway. Now, what various EU member states wish to avoid is the concept of what is termed dumping. That is, that the UK undercuts the EU in areas in which they are competing for trade by watering down or even completely removing standards in certain areas. Boris Johnson insists that this will not be the case, but he has been known to tell the odd fib now and again. Usually when he opens his mouth or when he writes something down. And, he was saying this before the general election as well. Oh, I actually want to strengthen worker rights and environmental standards. So why are you removing commitments to them? Oh, reasons. Just reasons. So they are wise to be wary. I am wary. But as to which standards the UK should agree to, that's a little bit less clear at the moment, although it does seem to be leaning one particular way. So the chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, has been reported to favour getting the UK to agree to current standards on the environment and worker rights, but that the UK would be free to keep them at that level whilst the EU enhances their own. However, he does want the UK to keep in step with EU state aid rules dynamically. Now, I don't know what Boris Johnson would think to that as such. However, it doesn't look like that would be what the EU will push, even though he is the chief negotiator, because the EU Parliament Committee on EU-UK Coordination, which has just been formed with the new EU Parliament, has said that it would like the UK to keep up with standards in all three areas. Dynamic equivalence in all of those areas. So in other words, when the EU tightens up its laws in one of those areas, the UK should do the same. It doesn't have to copy that law, it could do it in a different way, as long as it's equivalent, as long as it's of the same value. And this group will be very influential in determining how the EU Parliament as a whole are likely to vote on the approval of a final deal. There's no point in trying to agree a deal that the EU Parliament is unlikely to ratify at the end of it all, because that's just wasting everyone's time, and we already don't really have enough time. So that negotiating position is to be put to a vote in the EU Parliament next week, with a view to also adding in a few other things. So that would include requesting that Boris Johnson clarifies his position on the Irish border agreement. And that's because the agreement says one thing, and he's been telling the public something completely different. So I think they'd quite like to know that he understands what he's agreed to, because it seems not from what he's saying publicly. Other proposals also would include signing up to the EU's anti-money laundering scheme, Not sure Johnson will be as keen on that, as the whole point of Brexit for some of his backers was money laundering purposes anyway. It was the fear of the anti-money laundering EU proposals, which are now online, that had them wanting to push Brexit in the first place. Finally, one little bone that may be thrown to Boris Johnson is over the issue of the European Court of Justice. So, as it stands, Boris Johnson would like to look tough by getting a deal that means that you don't have to go to the European Court of Justice if anyone has a trade dispute. You know, but the European Court of Justice is the final arbiter in these disputes. That's just the way it is with the single market. But it seems that people in the EU are not very precious about this. You can't just not have a court. When you've got trade disputes between countries, there needs to be an international court to decide. But it seems that for influential people in the EU, it doesn't absolutely have to be the European Court of Justice. That being said, there is a little bit of a problem in that the EU treaties state that only the European Court of Justice can interpret EU law. So there would have to be some changes for that. But it does seem that there's scope for compromise there. Problem is that Brexiteers are not really the compromising types, as we have seen in the past few years. Also, if this was a realistic proposal, then this is what I would be expecting. So I would expect Boris Johnson to play with words and get him and his ministers to keep saying, we're not going to be respecting the European Court of Justice. We're not going to bow down before the European Court of Justice. And that way, when a new court is set up to decide on these things instead, he gets to say, there, we're not going to the European Court of Justice. They have got nothing to do with our trade with the EU. We have this other one. But that's not the language they're using. That's what worries me. They keep saying European courts. They just keep saying we're not going to be subject to the European courts, which is actually a lie, because we are still a member of the Council of Europe and therefore still bound by the European Court of Human Rights. And because that isn't a specifically EU body. The EU is also subject to it because it is a member of the Council of Europe as well as its individual member states. So, in fact, every country in Europe, bar one, is a member of the Council of Europe. So every country in Europe, bar one, and that one is not ours, is bound by the European Court of Human Rights. So, but the fact that they keep saying European courts, because, you know, if another court was set up specifically for disputes between the UK and the EU, it would still be a European court by definition, albeit one run jointly between the EU and the UK, because the UK is still, regardless of what some seem to think, a European country. That's just a matter of geography. So although it looks like the EU are willing to compromise quite a lot, there's definitely scope for a genuine Brexiteer, for someone who just genuinely wanted to leave the EU but still get a deal with the EU. There's massive amounts of scope there for compromise without the EU having to damage the integrity of their single market. And the compromises would be very, very easy to sell to even the Brexit supporting section of the British population. It's just that the language being used by Johnson and his government still seems to be ruling all this out. But if he really does want to go for a no-deal Brexit for 2021, then it does look at least like we have the bones of a good trade deal for the future when we finally get a government that wants to take it seriously. Whether that be Boris Johnson's own government after he sees the effects of his own lunacy in 2021, or with whoever replaces him. But there we are. That is the level playing field as the EU would like to see it. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, then please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.